On the north shore of Lake Superior, on an island called Isle Royale, there are pits cut into the rock that were dug before anyone thought to write down who did the digging. Thousands of them, running along ridgelines the length of the island, some no wider than a grave, some deep enough to swallow two men standing on each other's shoulders. Explorers in the early 1800s found the ground already worked over, the shafts filled with centuries of leaves and roots grown through collapsed timber shoring. Copper prospectors opening new veins kept striking old ones already emptied. Stone hammers by the thousand, some grooved for handles, some plain river cobbles battered flat on one face, turned up at the bottom of shafts that modern crews still find difficult to reach. Wooden shovels, charred and preserved in wet ground, came up in 1848 from a pit near the Ontonagon River, still showing the marks of hand tools. Whoever mined this rock did not use iron. They built fires against the copper-bearing stone, cracked it with cold water, and worked loose whatever fractured free, one pit at a time, across a span the evidence now suggests ran for thousands of years. Near a sheltered inlet called Macargo Cove, some of the densest concentrations of pits sit within walking distance of open water, close enough to load a canoe with worked copper and be moving toward the mainland within the hour. The question was never whether someone had been here first. The pits made that obvious the moment prospectors opened them. The question was who, and where all that copper went. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Archaeologists now group these workings under a single name, the Old Copper Complex, a mining and tool-making tradition centered on Lake Superior's shoreline and its two copper-bearing peninsulas, Keweenaw and Isle Royale. The copper here is unusual. It occurs in a form called native copper, meaning it comes out of the ground already metallic and nearly pure, needing no furnace and no smelting to become usable. A miner working this rock could pull a nugget free and cold hammer it directly into a knife, a spear point, an awl, a bracelet. That single fact made the region a source unlike almost any other on the continent, and it explains why the mining continued for so long. Radiocarbon dates from charcoal recovered inside the pits push the earliest activity back at least 7,000 years, and some researchers argue the true beginning is older still, placing the first miners here at work well before the pyramids at Giza were raised, using a metal that would not be independently worked at comparable scale anywhere else in North America for millennia. More than 5,000 of these pits have been catalogued across Isle Royale and the Keweenaw Peninsula alone, a number that keeps climbing as survey teams find more beneath second-growth forest. And the objects made from this copper did not stay near the mines. Archaeologists have recovered Lake Superior copper, identified by its specific trace element signature, from burial sites in Louisiana, from mound complexes in Ohio and Wisconsin, from sites along the Gulf Coast more than 1,000 miles south of where it was pulled from the rock. The objects themselves range from simple to intricate: fishhooks, awls, socketed spear points, beads hammered thin enough to bend, and ornamental panels that took real skill to shape without ever melting the metal down. Some of it turns up at Poverty Point in Louisiana, a site with no local copper source of its own, and some at the earthwork complexes built later in the Ohio Valley, hundreds of years and hundreds of miles removed from Lake Superior in either direction, carried hand to hand along routes no single traveler ever covered start to finish. A trade network that old, moving a raw material that far, without a wheel and without a written ledger, is not a small claim. It is one the physical evidence keeps confirming every time someone digs in the right place. Here the puzzle sharpens. Archaeologists who total the volume of rock removed from the Isle Royale and Keweenaw pits, weighed against the copper artifacts recovered from settlements near those same pits, find a mismatch. Far more metal came out of the ground than has ever turned up in the tools, ornaments, and grave goods found close to where it was mined. Researchers who have spent decades studying the region's prehistory have written plainly that the volume extracted over the life of these workings does not match what stayed local, and that the gap is too large to explain through loss or poor preservation alone. Most of it moved. Where the physical trail goes quiet, the oral record does not. Among the Ojibwe, whose ancestors lived along Lake Superior's shore for the entire span the mining pits cover, Copper was never treated as an ordinary mineral. The ethnographer Henry Schoolcraft, who served as the United States Indian agent at Sault Ste. Marie beginning in 1822 and documented Ojibwe oral tradition more extensively than any outsider of his generation, recorded a belief shared across several Great Lakes communities that copper belonged to powerful beings said to live beneath the lake's surface, guardians of the underwater world, and that taking it from the earth without proper respect and offering carried real consequence. This was not a superstition attached to a resource. It was the terms under which the resource could be used at all. A mineral this valuable, this workable, sitting this close to the surface, was not something the people who lived beside it failed to understand. The tradition Schoolcraft recorded describes a people who knew what was in the ground, managed its extraction across an enormous span of time, and built a set of obligations around handling it responsibly. That is a different story than the one the pits alone can tell. It is the story of the pits from the inside. For much of the 19th century, the scientific establishment refused to accept that ancestors of the Ojibwe, or any indigenous nation living in the region when Europeans arrived, could have organized mining on this scale. The prevailing theory, printed in newspapers and repeated in early archaeological journals, held that a vanished race, sometimes described as a lost tribe, sometimes as ancient Phoenicians or Norsemen, must have dug the pits and disappeared before recorded history began, leaving the ancestors of the people who actually lived there with no connection to the work at all. This was not a fringe opinion, it was closer to consensus among the antiquarians and early geologists writing about the region through the 1800s. The theory served a purpose beyond archaeology. If native people had not built the mines, mounds, and earthworks scattered across the eastern half of the continent, there was no need to reckon with the sophistication of the societies being displaced by American expansion at the exact same moment those theories were being published. It took the Smithsonian Institution's own Bureau of Ethnology, under the direction of Cyrus Thomas, until 1894 to formally overturn the lost race theory, concluding after a nationwide survey of hundreds of sites that the mound-building cultures were the direct ancestors of contemporary native nations. By then, the theory had shaped textbooks, newspapers, and public understanding for 2 full generations, long enough to become the default explanation most Americans encountered without ever hearing it questioned. The Lake Superior pits were swept into the same framework. Popular writers speculated about Old World seafarers reaching the lake thousands of years before Columbus, bypassing entirely the oral tradition that had already named who mined the rock and why. The people who could have answered the question directly were treated as a source of folklore rather than a source of history, even while they were living beside the evidence the entire time. Nowhere is that pattern more concrete than the fate of a single boulder. On the Ontonagon River, not far from the lake's southern shore, sat a mass of native copper weighing nearly 2 tons, exposed at the surface, visible to anyone who walked the riverbank. Ojibwe communities in the area knew the boulder well before any American prospector saw it, and Schoolcraft's own reports describe it as a recognized, named feature of the landscape, treated with the same regard given to other places associated with the underwater spirits. In 1843, a prospector named Julius Eldred organized an expedition to remove the boulder entirely, hauling it by sledge and barge over land and water that belonged, by treaty, to Ojibwe bands who had not agreed to give the stone up. Accounts from the period describe local resistance to the removal, resistance Eldred worked around rather than resolved. The boulder reached the East Coast, was displayed for a fee in cities along the way, and became the subject of a legal dispute over its ownership between Eldred and the federal government, which argued the copper had never been his to sell in the first place. That dispute dragged on for years before it was settled with a payment to Eldred and formal transfer of the boulder into government hands. It was eventually handed to the War Department and later to the Smithsonian Institution, where it remains today, a fixed exhibit in the National Museum of Natural History in Washington. It is, by any reasonable measure, the single largest and most legible piece of evidence connecting Lake Superior copper to the people who lived beside it, and it has spent more than a century sitting in a federal building 1,000 miles from the river it was pulled out of, described to visitors mainly as a mineral specimen rather than as an object with a documented history of contested removal. The boulder did not disappear, it was relocated, catalogued, and folded into a narrative that had already decided, before it arrived, what an object like that was allowed to mean. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What survived of the Ojibwe account of the boulder and of the mining tradition more broadly survived mostly because of one man's insistence on writing it down. Schoolcraft was an unusual figure for his time. An Indian agent whose wife, Bamiwawajejikakwe, was herself Ojibwe, and whose household gave him access to oral tradition that most government officials of the period never sought and would not have understood if offered. His published collections, drawn from years of conversation rather than a single interview, preserve descriptions of the underwater spirits associated with copper, of the respect the metal was owed, and of specific places along the lake, including the Ontonagon boulder, that carried meaning beyond their mineral content. Later folklorists working in the same region, cataloguing stories into the early 20th century, recorded versions of the same tradition from different communities along the lake, independently confirming details Schoolcraft had written down decades earlier without any coordination between the two efforts. None of this made it into the geological surveys or mining company reports produced during the same years the copper rush was stripping the peninsula for industrial extraction. Those documents describe assay values, shaft depths, and projected yields. They do not mention who had mined the rock first, or why, because the surveyors conducting them had already accepted the lost race framework and had no reason to ask. The oral record and the institutional record were being compiled during the exact same decades, about the exact same landscape, by people who never compared notes. One treated the mining pits as a resource to be reopened. The other treated them as a set of workings their own ancestors had paused rather than abandoned. That distinction, resumed against reopened, is not a small one. It is the difference between a mystery and a memory, and for most of the 19th and 20th centuries, the institutions producing the official record treated a memory as a mystery, because a mystery did not require asking anyone still living what they already knew. Archaeological work on the old copper complex has continued well past Schoolcraft's era, and it keeps confirming the scale of what the oral record always implied. Burial sites in Wisconsin, including a cemetery near Oconto excavated in the 1950s, produced copper tools and ornaments placed deliberately with the dead, arranged in ways that read as ceremony rather than casual use, alongside stone tools and shell material that had themselves traveled a long way to reach that grave. Trace element studies developed in recent decades can now match a copper artifact found 1,000 miles from Lake Superior back to the specific outcrop it was likely pulled from, and the number of long-distance matches keeps growing as more museum collections get tested rather than left in storage. None of that fieldwork required inventing anything. It required someone deciding the question was worth asking, and for most of 2 centuries, most of the institutions in a position to ask it did not. That has started to change in the way the sites are actually managed. Isle Royale National Park and the National Park Service units on the Keweenaw Peninsula now work directly with Ojibwe tribal historic preservation offices when surveying or interpreting mining areas, treating the pits as part of a living cultural landscape rather than an abandoned industrial curiosity waiting for outside explanation. It is a slow correction to a much older habit, and it does not undo a century and a half of the opposite approach, but it marks the first time in that long record that the people whose ancestors dug the pits have had a formal role in deciding how the pits get talked about. The pits are still there. Isle Royale is a national park now, reachable only by boat or seaplane, and rangers lead hikes past mining depressions that are, in places, difficult for an untrained eye to separate from natural erosion until someone points out the regularity of the pattern, pit after pit along a vein, spaced the way a person spaces work rather than the way weather does. Archaeologists continue to recover copper artifacts from sites across the eastern half of the continent that trace back, through trace element analysis, to this exact source, and every new discovery adds to a trade network that was already understood to be extensive and keeps turning out to be larger. A pendant catalogued in one state museum, a fishhook logged decades ago in another, sitting in storage for years before anyone ran the comparison that placed its origin on this specific island. The core question, how so much copper was extracted over so many centuries while so little of it stayed near the mines, remains open in its specifics, even if the broad outline is no longer seriously disputed. Some of it moved through exchange networks archaeologists have spent decades mapping. Some of it may still be sitting in caches never properly catalogued when they were assembled. And some portion of the answer may simply be unrecoverable, lost to time the way most decisions made by specific people 7,000 years ago are lost, regardless of how good the surrounding evidence is. What is recoverable, and what the record actually supports, is that this was never a mystery to everyone. It was a managed resource, worked under a set of beliefs about who owned it and what taking it required, by people whose descendants are still living along the same shoreline the copper came from. The boulder that once sat on the Ontonagon River can be visited today, sitting under museum lighting in Washington, its original context reduced to a placard. The pits it came from can also be visited, sitting under open sky on an island that takes half a day to reach by boat, still shaped exactly the way they were left. Return to the pits themselves, cut into Isle Royale's ridgelines before anyone thought to write down who was digging. The mismatch between what came out of that rock and what stayed nearby is not, on its own, proof of anything beyond an active and extensive trade network, which the archaeological record already supports without dispute. What changes the shape of the story is the ethnographic record sitting beside the archaeological one, testimony collected in the 1820s and 1830s, describing a relationship to this exact copper that predates by centuries the mining companies who arrived expecting to be first. The Ojibwe did not need the pits explained to them. They needed the pits to stop being reopened by people who assumed no explanation already existed. The lost race theory has been formally retired for more than a century now, but its residue is still visible in how casually this region gets discussed, as a puzzle waiting for modern archaeology to solve, rather than a landscape whose original stewards already understood. 7,000 years is a long time to manage a resource carefully enough that outsiders, arriving at the very end of that span, mistook the discipline for absence. It is also a long time for a body of knowledge to survive mostly by word of mouth, passed from one generation to the next, through story rather than through anything a 19th century surveyor would have recognized as a document, which may be the simplest reason it took so long for anyone outside the community to take it seriously, and the simplest reason it never actually needed to be rediscovered at all. The pits are still cut into the rock, the boulder is still under glass in Washington, and the account that connects the two, patient, specific, and recorded before most of the mining companies had drawn their first survey maps, is still sitting in library collections, waiting for the kind of attention that gets paid so easily to a boulder, a pit, a trace of copper turning up in a mound 1,000 miles south. The land kept its own record the entire time. It was simply not the one people went looking for first. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.